Hello and welcome to this video on looking at the impacts and responses to the Hurricane Sandy that occurred in October 2012. Now this is part of the GCSE edXL paper looking at weather hazards and climate change. Okay, so that physical paper looking at that particular topic. Okay, so let's think back to what ingredients we need for a tropical storm to start forming. So I want you to take 2 minutes, answer those 4 questions, pause the video. Let's see what you can remember in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, welcome back. Just a little bit of quick recap. What time of year do hurricanes form? Well, late summer to early autumn, because this is when the oceans are at their warmest. They've had all summer to warm up. Remember, we need ocean temperatures to reach at least 27 degrees Celsius for tropical storms to start forming. They form near the equator, around 5 degrees to 30 degrees north or south of the equator. Remember, not on the equator, but just north or south of that equator. Remember, we need low pressure where the air is rising to allow that storm to start forming. And it's the Coriolis effect which causes that tropical storm to start spinning. Okay, bit more recap. Characteristics of a tropical storm. What type of weather do we get where there are areas of low pressure? Let's have a think. Take 10 seconds to have a think. Pause the video if you need to. What type of weather do we get where there are areas of low pressure? Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So remember, in areas of low pressure, where that air is allowed to rise, which means evaporation is taking place. As the air starts to cool in the atmosphere, condensation can take place, meaning that in areas of low pressure, we often get very stormy and wet conditions, okay? Often associated with heavy amounts of rainfall. Okay, so with that in mind, have a little think, take a minute, pause the video. What hazards might be created because of a tropical storm? Remember, a hazard is something that poses risk to life or can also have harmful consequences. Pause the video in 3, 2, 1, write down your ideas. Okay, welcome back. So let's think some of those hazards we associate with tropical storm. Really intense rainfall, high wind speeds, storm surge. So storm surge is when the high wind speeds cause those sea levels to rise, which can often mean and lead to things such as coastal and inland flooding. And then finally, that intense torrential rainfall can make the ground really unstable, which can cause sudden movements in that ground, and this can cause landslides. Okay, so last bit of recap before we look at Hurricane Sandy. What is the best way to describe magnitude when we're talking about tropical storms? Is it A, how often a tropical storm occurs, or B, the strength of a tropical storm? Get your answer in your head. 3, 2, 1. Okay, the answer is B. Okay, magnitude describes the strength of a tropical storm. And remember that can vary from tropical storm to tropical storm. So we're looking at Hurricane Sandy because it covers this part of our GCSE specification. So we need to look at the different social, economic, and environmental impacts that tropical cyclones can have on a named developed and a named emerging or developing country. So Hurricane Sandy occurred in the USA. So this means we're looking at a tropical cyclone in a named developed country. Remember, a developed country can be categorized by a high GDP per capita, high literacy rates, relatively high life expectancy, good access to education, often good investment in infrastructure. These are all things that we would have looked at in the global development topic in the human side of this course. Okay, so When we're looking at the global distribution of where tropical storms form, remember in the Atlantic Ocean and the East Pacific Ocean, we call tropical storms hurricanes. In the Indian Ocean and on the west coast of Australia, they're called cyclones. And then in the West Pacific Ocean, we call them typhoons. So Hurricane Sandy formed in this region in the Caribbean. That is why it was classified as a hurricane. Okay, so if we look at the path that Hurricane Sandy took, so starting off on the 22nd of October 2012, Hurricane Sandy forms in the warm oceans of the Caribbean with wind speeds of only 13 miles per hour. You can see if you look here on the left, 15 degrees north of the equator is where Hurricane Sandy started forming. Started moving north. On the 25th of October, Sandy heads north over Cuba and heads to the southeast of the USA, reaching wind speeds of 100 miles per hour. Remember, when we're categorizing hurricanes and looking at their wind speeds, we use the Saffir-Simpson scale. So it started off with 30 mile per hour wind speed. So when it started to form, it was classified as a tropical depression. And then it moved up to 100 miles per hour as it heading north. We can categorize this as a category 2 hurricane. Okay, so we can use the wind speeds and the storm surge to help us understand the magnitude of these hurricanes. Okay. On the 26th to 28th of October, it heads north along the east coast of the USA at wind speeds between 65 to 75 miles per hour. So it's dropped down to a category 1 hurricane now. On the 29th of October, it starts to move inland towards the US state of New York with wind speeds reaching 80 miles per hour. So it's still classified as a category 1 hurricane. And this is when it's starting to pose a threat to those people who live in the northeast coast of the USA. And then on the 30th of October, as it moves further inland, wind speeds start to decrease. So remember, as a hurricane moves inland, it loses its energy source. Okay, remember its energy source is that warm ocean temperatures that we find close to the equator. So as it moves further inland, it's losing its fuel to allow it to continue to grow, to ensure those wind speeds are high. And that's why the hurricane starts to dissipate. Okay, so when the hurricane hit, it obviously had impacts on people, and these are what we call social impacts. So around 147 people were killed directly by the hurricane. These deaths would have been caused by collapsing homes and flooding as a result of the storm surge. Around 200,000 homes were destroyed during the hurricane, leading to around 30,000 to 40,000 people being made homeless. Electricity lines were damaged, affecting around 8 million residents. As a result, many of these residents were forced to evacuate their homes. Think about all those things you rely on for electricity. If those are destroyed, it's going to make life a little bit more difficult. For some people, a lot more difficult. Okay. As well as impacts on people, it's going to have impacts on jobs and money, or anything that supports the country's economy. Now, we call these economic impacts. So Hurricane Sandy was estimated to cost around $71 billion in damages. In New York City alone, the total economic losses are estimated at more than $18 billion. Businesses were lost due to the damage to buildings, with an estimated 30,000 job losses. Many businesses did not have insurance because they did not suspect such a large storm to ever hit New York City. Okay, and on the right, on the bottom right-hand corner here, we can see all the flights that were meant to be arriving into New York City during this time. Around 15,000 flights into New York and the East Coast airports were cancelled. This meant that people could not fly into the city for work. Okay. And finally, we can categorize the impacts into environmental, so anything that has an impact on the physical environment and those natural surroundings. In areas around New York and New Jersey, flooding caused around 1.5 billion tons of untreated sewage to pollute the Raritan River. Approximately 10 meters of beach was lost in some parts of New Jersey, exposing the coast to future erosion and impacting wildlife habitats. Flooding of industrial sites caused around 300,000 gallons of oil to spill into the New Jersey waterways. This would threaten the local ecosystems and wildlife that lives in the area. Okay, so we looked at the impacts, and now we've got to understand how the country responded to that Hurricane Sandy. Now we can categorize these into individual, organizations, and government. So individual responses, example might be providing shelter for your relatives. Organization, for example, charities providing food aid. So providing meals to those who aren't able to get food for themselves. And government responses, for example, emergency services evacuating those that are stranded. So for Hurricane Sandy, people posted images of the aftermath of the storm on social media sites, allowing government bodies to assess the damage before the storm had passed. Also, 50,000 people were made homeless, and these either moved in with relatives or had to use temporary shelters. Okay, so that's looking at how individuals responded to the hurricane. Now we can look at some of the organizations' responses. Charities such as the Red Cross were involved in providing relief to people in affected areas, funded through charity concerts and telethons after the events. That's ringing people up, asking them to donate. AmeriCares, a charity in the USA, has raised over $7.1 million in aid in the 2 years since the hurricane. This is estimated to help around 450,000 people. And the Red Cross trained 17,000 people to provide 17 million meals, and they provided shelter for around 74,000 people. And finally, the Canadian Rivers Institute worked with a number of other NGOs. Remember, NGO stands for non-governmental organizations, and public agencies to restore beaches for horseshoe crabs. Okay. And finally, the government response. So what did the US government do? The US government, at this time, Obama was president, voted in legislation to provide $60.3 billion in aid to create a task force for rebuilding homes and supporting victims. FEMA, which is the government department responsible for the emergency teams, were put in place to help people evacuate and prepare even before the hurricane struck. They also gave out 14 million meals to those people who were left stranded and had to use those temporary shelters. The Department for Agriculture promised $6.2 million for emergency food assistance and to repair farmland and floodplains. Okay, so we've got a lot of impacts there. I want you to go and have a look back at those impacts, and I want you to decide for yourself which were the most effective and which were the least effective. So we're assessing the response here. Okay, so we're thinking about the short term, so which ones are going to be most effective immediately after the hurricane. The long term, what's needed to actually recover from this hurricane months and years after it hit. And also, how is this going to affect the rest of the country if another hurricane comes in the future? So I want you to try and categorize those impacts into least effective and most effective, thinking about short term, long term, and whole country. So I want you to spend 3 minutes having a go at that on your own. So pause the video, look back at those impacts. Pause the video in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, welcome back. So you might have copied this out into a book on a piece of paper and then added something here, looking at the most effective. I decided to say that FEMA helped people before the tropical storm hit. Okay, so they actually went in and evacuated people. That's not going to stop their houses being damaged, so it doesn't help recover them in the long term. So I put it here next to short term. Okay, last bit. I want you to decide what you think the most effective response was, and I want you to give a reason for that. So I want you to pause the video again and spend 2 minutes. You can use these sentence starters to help you. I want you to try and decide which is the most effective. I want you to give a reason why. Pause the video in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, you should have a sentence there explaining which was the most effective. Here's my response. I think that the most effective response was the voting in of legislation that provided $60.3 million in aid to create a recovery task force. This is because it would support thousands of people to repair their damaged homes and will help build the infrastructure needed to protect people and the environment from future tropical storms. So it's actually helping those people get back into their homes, repair their homes, any damage, and make sure that they're back to where they were before the hurricane hit. Okay, that's our video on Hurricane Sandy.